Where would be the most useful place for us to dive in?
Maybe we could start with the logical reasoning questions first, if that's okay. That's just where I am in my studying at this stage.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. So shoot.
So the first one is mostly in terms of timing, the different section. And I think what I'm really good at is getting the first 10 questions in 10 minutes down, but then seem to lose track of my pacing after that. So what would you recommend in terms of pacing between the 10th question and the end? And then related to that, how would you recommend identifying which ones to flag and how many to flag and then come back to at the end of the section?
Sure. So personally, I would typically flag 3 or 4 questions. And I would recognize those as being the ones that are most difficult for me. So there will be some variation from person to person, what you find most difficult, but a couple of candidates that typically I want to flag, and many students do as well, are longer questions with more words. So parallel reasoning, principal application questions, and questions involving complex vocabulary, especially topics on philosophy, aestheticism, art, and then of course science, anything especially technical or unfamiliar.
Okay.
Those would be good questions to skip. If they appear in the first 10, of course, then they're probably not so hard because the method of reasoning at least will be simple. But those are ways that LSAC ramps up the difficulty. As for the question of time allocation after question number 10, I don't really have any specific recommendations on this. There is a general increase in difficulty as you go forward, but the last couple may be a little bit easier as well. And so typically I'll find that questions 15 through 22 or 15 through 23 are the toughest, and that's usually the range from which I'll pull my 3 or 4 questions.
Okay. All right, great. And would you say somewhere around 1 minute and 30 seconds for those other questions? Or how would you, if the 10 minutes are kind of done, how would you recommend breaking up the timing among the rest of the questions?
I don't think about it specifically. I don't want to overanalyze every single or have benchmarks for every single question or even every 5 questions. I think the first 10, that's really where I leave off with benchmarks. After that, you could say, well, a minute 30 versus a minute 40. How significant is that difference really? Obviously 10 seconds can make a difference, but for me, it's more like my toughest questions, I might spend 2 minutes or more, but then something else will be more intuitive, and I might still get through number 11 or 12 in 1 minute. So for me, it's really about getting through the first 10 quickly, building up a time bank to tackle the more difficult questions a little bit more slowly, and then circling back to those toughest 3 and 4 that I flagged at the very end and giving them whatever they need mixed with whatever time I have remaining.
Right. Okay. That sounds good. I'll give that a go and see how it works out.
Yeah, sure. And one last thing I would add to this is really just recognizing when you're getting bogged down in something, when you're not making headway. That's a candidate for skipping, flagging, coming back to. I think if you can notice when you're getting bogged down and not making headway, that's really the biggest way that I could save time in logical reasoning for you.
And would you recommend it's better to try to work through it a little bit or just drop it and move on and come back to it?
Well, it's fine to try. The issue is when you start spinning your wheels and get locked into a kind of tunnel vision. The nice thing about skipping and flagging is that you can then come back with a fresh perspective. And even if you can't get it in the end, that was a tough one anyway that your odds were lower on. And it was better for you to spend your time on the other questions in this section.
Sure. Okay. That's great. That's really helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Sure.
The next question I have is both related to logic games and logical reasoning. So I just want to clarify a really simple thing, which is doing the contrapositive for anything that's worded as neither X nor Y. Is that the same as and?
Yeah, so the word or, the word nor, excuse me, is like a negative version of and. So neither X nor Y means negative X plus negative Y. So that essentially means that you have the word and in your sufficient condition. So it's 2 variables together in their negative forms are sufficient to guarantee something else. Now the word and, when you take a contrapositive, becomes or. So in this example, you're going to have positive X or positive Y in the necessary condition of the resulting statement.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And then somewhat related to that is a question around working through logic games and trying to decide when do I work through each of the answer choices one by one and try to plug them into a specific diagram, or do I go the route of trying to use process of elimination first? And which ones? I think one is much more time consuming than the other, but it's very difficult for me to tell based on the question type which of those options I should pursue.
Yeah, and I think it's not really about the question type. So I understand where you're coming from. I think it's much more about the scenarios that you have available to you up to that point in the game. It's possible that if you're attempting this question later in the game, that you'll have enough valid scenarios, hypotheticals from previous drawings or from the initial orientation question, that you may be able to use those to help you apply process of elimination. So I would do that first. Right. And then once you've exhausted those, then you might have to plug in the 2 or 3 remaining answer choices. But the idea is that you minimize the number you have to plug in, because plugging in all 5, that's brute force. And that can get you there, but it's not the most efficient way to do things.
Sure. Okay. Clearly, a lot of my questions end up focusing on timing, because I think that's an area where I really need to speed things up as best I can.
Yeah, well, timing's a huge part of this exam, even aside from the accuracy question. So I think that just indicates to me that you're past the point at which accuracy is the primary concern. So that's a good thing.
Well, I hope so. We'll see. On the timing note as well, what is your advice around working through, say, a necessary assumption question where I get to answer C and it seems very, very clear to me that this is 100% the answer? Is it worth going to answers D and E and still looking at them? And how can I use being quite certain of an answer to gain some time for some other questions that might take a lot more thinking around?
Yeah, that's a tough question, because I think that my general advice would be to always go through all 5, just to be safe, just to be sure. They're very crafty at making tempting wrong answers. And so it's generally a good idea to go through all 5 on all sections. But an exception for me would be perhaps the first 10 in logical reasoning. If you're good at logical reasoning, which you are, you have a good foundation. Your first instinct is likely correct. It's good to go with your gut. I wouldn't be second guessing yourself there. So if you're really in the mindset of, I want to blast through these as quickly as possible and build up the time bank for the tougher ones later, then with some hesitation, I would recommend not going through all 5 on some of the first 10 if you're super confident. But if it's a tougher question, I would certainly go through all 5 choices. And as for how you can use your confidence on choice C, it's really just with the mindset of evaluating D and E just to check, just to be safe. That's really it. But also be open to the idea that maybe there was something off about C that you missed. And if D or E looks good as well, then that means you really need to revisit something.
Right. Okay. All right. Great. And then another question I have is around the suggestion that you make in one of the videos about reading the question stem first for logical reasoning. And that's not something I've been doing for the several months I've been studying. It would take some probably adaptation to how I'm currently doing things to give that a try. A month and a half or less than a month and a half away from the LSAT. Is that something you'd recommend that I give it a go, or should I stick to what I'm doing? What is the advantage of doing that? And would I see some substantial improvements if I try to bring that into my studying approach this time?
So if you're happy with where you're at right now, or close to where you want to be, I don't think you need to radically change anything. There are plenty of top scorers who read question stem first. There are plenty of top scorers who read stimulus first. So if you're curious about it, you could do a section or 2 trying it the other way and see if it feels more natural, or see if it becomes progressively more natural for you as you work through those 2 sections. And then if you like it, you can switch. I think with a month and a half remaining, you have enough time to try out different things, but also if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Great. And I think my last question is around the grouping games that are the least structured, and the least restricted in terms of the number of rules that are given. I seem to be good at doing combined logic games, linear ones, but when it comes to the lack of clarity around how many could be in a group versus not in a group, I often freeze up and get a bit nervous or don't really know who's in, who's out. And those seem to take the longest for me. And there are times when I'll do several of them in a row and I'm really finding my stride and it clicks. And then there are other times I'll get to a game and it's like I haven't seen something like this in several weeks, even though I know I have. So other than, doing these every day or trying to get more practice, knowing that that's my weakness, are there other things I can consider that to just wrap my head around the approach that would help me approach it in a more positive way and hopefully make progress, not having to come back to it later in the round?
Sure. So my first answer is, in fact, practice. It is about exposure. It is about repetition. And so I do have to emphasize that will clear up a lot. If you do more and more games of those types, you will inevitably get better at them and better at seeing the patterns. The other thing I'll say, though, is that the LSAT as a whole is really a test of recognizing just how little we know, just how much uncertainty there is, even given a set of facts. And so lower scorers tend to be overconfident in assuming too much. The higher scorers tend to recognize just how little they can actually infer. So if this is really apparent with logical reasoning, but it does also apply to games where, given the rules, things are still really open-ended. Some games, of course, are a bit more regimented and there are only a few major possibilities, but grouping in out games with an undefined number of variables in or out, maybe you could have one, maybe you could have all seven if there are seven. And so just recognizing that it is very open-ended and there are too many possibilities to list, I think you just have to keep that in mind and just run with the rules that you're given.
Okay. And those are usually the questions, just going back to one of the earlier questions I asked, those are usually the instances when I find myself having to plug in each answer choice one by one and trying to diagram it because I don't necessarily have the structure already in front of me, or I haven't listed those out already in my previous answer choices.
So are these the grouping in-out games with long conditional chains?
Yeah, exactly.
So then if you're trying to solve those games without actually having the chains, it's going to be harder.
I have the chains, and then it's usually an instance of it's either one of the variables that's not present in the chain, or it's one that's towards the end of the chain. So it not having the understanding of where the other variables that precede it fall into play throws me off a bit.
Yeah, when you're starting with the end of the chain, there's much less you can infer. And so just recognizing that when you're at the end, much more is up in the air. Just becoming more comfortable with that.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, I think that's it from my side at this point. I'm sure I'll come up with a couple of other questions in the coming weeks.
Great. Well, it was really great to connect with you, Rachel. What would you say is the biggest insight you got from our call today?
I think it's accepting that I'm not going to have total clarity on all of the answers or all of the options available to me in the logic games, and that the biggest aspect of the LSAT is that a lot of it is unknown, and I just have to kind of embrace that if I want to succeed.
Awesome. I'm glad I was able to help. Please keep in touch, and I'll hope to see you in class soon. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.